Evening, everybody. Time is now 7 o'clock, and I'd like to call the City of Twinsburg Caucus meeting for February 11, 2025 to order. Shannon, please call the roll.
Mr. Post?
Here.
Mr. Bellin?
Here.
Mrs. Walker? Present. Mr. Fury?
Here.
Mrs. Labby? Here. Mr. Bonacci?
Here.
Mr. Barr?
All right. Do we have any presentations this evening?
There are none.
There are none. Any items for discussion, anybody in particular? Mr. Mayor? Mr. Fazana?
Yes. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So I wanted to draw everyone's attention to, let's see, it is ordinance number 20-2025. So we'll start there. That's a ordinance to extend the moratorium on accepting for filing and consideration and or issuing occupancy permits for any building, structure, use, blah, 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 or cultivation, processing, distribution, or sale of recreational marijuana. You might remember last year, or a little under a year ago, we passed a moratorium as we led into the code rewrite process for our zoning code. Tonight, the administration requests that you pass a 3-month extension of that for the purpose of considering a business regulation which would prohibit the not cultivation, not processing, but the dispensary. So that'd be the recreational retail sale. So I have drafted a baseline piece of legislation that I'll send out tomorrow for you to see, and we can have it come up for first reading at our next council meeting. But tonight, I would ask that you extend the 3-month moratorium so we have time to sort that out over the coming months and work with the council. So.
That seems reasonable. Does anybody have any comments to that question?
Yeah, Mr. Vazan,
Yes.
I do not recall the language in the ordinance of the initial moratorium. Did the moratorium speak both to dispensaries and to cultivation?
It did. That's a great question. This language is identical to the language for the original moratorium. It was an outright prohibition on any permits being issued pursuant to cultivation, processing, or sale.
Okay.
As we call that a dispensary. So a marijuana dispensary would be the recreational retail sale of marijuana. I will let you know, just kind of from a procedural historical standpoint with our underlying zoning regulations, cultivation and processing is permitted in the city of Twinsburg. It was also permitted prior to the new zoning code. Dispensaries, the baseline that was set with the zoning code rewrite was that dispensaries are not permitted. So currently, as it stands, we permit cultivation, we permit processing. Those would be what I call the industrial uses associated with marijuana production. But the retail uses, or the dispensary use, quote unquote, is not permitted in the zoning code that was adopted by the voters.
So just for clarification then, if we do not extend this moratorium, it ends on, I believe, the 13th of February.
That's correct.
Which is Thursday.
Correct. Yep.
If we extend this, is it just extending the dispensary portion, or is it also extending the cultivating portion as well?
Another great question. It is extending the cultivation and the processing, even though those are otherwise permitted underneath the, or pursuant to the recently adopted zoning code.
Thank you.
And that brings up a, sorry, Mr. Fury, go ahead.
Why don't you go first?
I was going to say, so just to set out the, we'll call it the full buffet of choices, should the council decide that they wanted to move forward with permitting the dispensary use somewhere, that would be, council could pass legislation to authorize that, but then that would have to go to the voters, obviously, to be approved as a separate or individual issue. So that, I anticipated that over the coming 3 months we could discuss that, and we'd use this business regulation, which is a real simple set of code. It actually mirrors what was adopted in Aurora, and I thought that'd be a good starting point because it mirrors what our underlying zoning is for the area. At that, sorry, Mr. Fury, please go ahead.
You answered my question.
Well, how about that?
Okay.
I'm usually known for more words rather than less, so.
I was
that's
going to
good
ask
hear.
you, if we made that change, we still have to go to the ballot regardless.
Correct,
to
yeah,
get
we
the
would go for
language
the
changed, 'cause
November
it-
ballot.
Right. So, I have another question.
Yes,
Why,
yeah.
why at this time we want to put a moratorium on the cultivation and manufacturing? Because the issue is our dispensary. We've already got that okayed in our code. You know, it's I-2, I believe, I-2? Is that where we stuck?
I am, yeah.
I am, excuse me, but I'm not sure why we would do that, what the benefit of,
Yeah, that's a good,
I don't know what the benefit
Yeah.
of not allowing that, since it's already intentionally passed our code.
Yeah.
We wanted to do that when we had presentations several years ago, and there's a benefit to the city in that part
Mm-hmm.
because of the taxes that we talked about at that point versus a retail store, which we probably, employees are going to be very minimal, I would think, I don't know.
that's a
But
very good
like
point.
10 or
If you
15
wanted to
people.
do that, you could amend it tonight to
Okay.
essentially release that portion of the moratorium and only move forward with 3 months on the retail dispensary side to give yourself time to fully, wrap your heads around.
Does anybody else have a thought on that? Because we're talking about just doing a motion to make a change. It's we can do that. It's,
Yeah.
it's just an amendment.
Rebecca, do we know if anyone's pursuing anything like this in the city?
So that would be more than 3 months anyways. Even if they were, they would.
Yeah, I mean, you could just amend it to release the moratorium with respect to cultivation and processing, but retain the existing moratorium, or what's left, the balance of the moratorium for 3 more months. And that'd be perfectly fine.
All right, I agree with that.
Where I'm lost, and if you can help me understand it, if the code says we already can't have it as a structural code, why do we need the business code?
Two different questions.
What did you say, Bill? I didn't hear you.
I think there's, I don't understand your question.
So
Well, I think that why are we taking like a belt and suspenders kind of approach? I would say that when I read,
I don't understand that either.
I don't know.
I'm just telling you.
I don't know what that-
I missed that one.
I was good up until I wasn't.
sometimes a belt's not enough and the suspenders are there for an extra
well,
protection.
So that's what I say when you're trying to make it abundantly clear about a position for a municipality. So when I looked at what the state law passed, they passed a law that permitted recreational marijuana use. Everybody's pretty familiar with that at this point. They also passed a law within that permitted municipalities the ability to prohibit or regulate the retail dispensing of recreational marijuana. So what I have seen other cities do is adopt essentially a two-pronged approach to making the regulatory scheme clear. I will agree with you that you could just rely on your zoning code, from a power of local self-government standpoint, so the 1/2 of home rule authority. But what I'm seeing other cities do is, because this is an issue of first impression, and because there are a lot of people that are coming in and putting in permits, they're having their business regulations, which are explicitly authorized by the General Assembly through the act that permitted recreational marijuana, mimic what the underlying zoning regulations are. And so while I can admit that you could just rely on your zoning, I believe that from a clarity standpoint, a lot of the users within these types of spaces, so when you think about short-term rentals, look back to the, oh my gosh, what were they called? Those internet cafes, the proprietors of those entities look to the business regulations first to see, whether or not there are regulations that impact whether or not they can operate the business before they go into the underlying zoning code. So this is kind of one of those where it's my advice that we should have our business regulations mimic our land use regulations to make sure that the position the city takes on it is clear and there isn't any type of competing interest as it relates to somebody that puts in a permit and says, well, you don't have a business regulation on this, I'm going to put in a permit based on X, Y, and Z, and now we're fighting whether or not that, that fact that we don't have a regulatory scheme, does that mean we implicitly permit it? I think we're going to win that argument in the end, but I always take the position, let's try to eliminate situations where we're even arguing about things if we don't have to. But that is a great question. It is something also, Mr. Bonacci, that I went back and forth on for months, frankly, and just kept following some of our neighboring communities to see what types of initiatives they were proposing as their moratoriums were beginning to expire or being extended. Because I think some of our neighbors, and I can't name off the top of my head, Rebecca might be able to do this because she has a wonderful sheet, but it lists, some of our neighbors and where they're at. Some of them still have moratoriums in place as they consider what to do within the land use and the business regulation side. So our police power, business regulation, land use, our power of local self-government. Do you have a follow-up, Mr. Bonacci?
We'll let regular questions go, and then I have a related question.
Follow up.
Is there a way to have this business use regulation expanded beyond marijuana to include businesses that are primarily selling THC products?
So for us to,
I guess, may I ask a question? Okay. Don't you have to have a dispensary to be able to sell THC products like gummies and stuff?
Because you can get very low dose. I was actually just in a store recently. I had no idea, but you walk in the back and they had all this low dose stuff that's completely legal. Huh?
It's THC derived from hemp-based products.
Yes, and that's what it was. I had no idea. We walked in the store. We had no idea. It was over in Bainbridge, and you walk in the back of the store. We thought it was just a wine store, and in the back they built a room that had THC products. But because the guy was telling me it was under this was just last week. He was telling me because it's under 3%, I think, and we're like, no idea. But they're like, oh, so that's a great point.
So
I haven't heard of anyone regulating CBD or THC, THC at a level that isn't marijuana, recreational marijuana. I think it is the 3% or whatever you said.
So my thought process, and forgive me, Mr. Post, is the way Ohio allows for cigar shops to allow smoking, and it's because that's like a little loophole of that's their primary business. If your primary business is vape products, like why I see no difference in THC, whether it's recreational marijuana well regulated by the state of Ohio through a series of things that we have control over, versus these other shops popping up that are selling effectively the same substance while a lower dose. It's the equivalent of a state liquor store versus a beer store. Why can't we regulate, or could we look into regulating that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd be happy to look into it. We can regulate, as I noted, in the act that passed or legalized recreational marijuana. We are explicitly authorized by the state to place regulations related to the public health, safety, and welfare of our residents on the marijuana. But I don't know, and I haven't seen yet about do we have the authority to regulate, the sale or the businesses that sell derivatives that don't actually rise to the level of recreational marijuana, if I'm understanding correctly. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to look into that to see if there's any wiggle room in that.
So being that we already have a zoning code that already states the one, and being that, we have nobody even interested in the industrial, I know you want to get this in because February 13th was coming up.
Yeah.
To extend it, but
Plus, I wanted to have time to discuss whether or not we wanted to talk about initiatives, for certain areas, if it was something you want to permit. But,
would it be smart just to hold off 2 weeks and look into that as well? I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a rush on this today, is there?
Don't we already have
It's already in the zoning
we already
code.
have it zoned that we can't do it? Do we have to do this on top to make it look like we're looking at it?
You don't have to do it. Like I said, it's my advice that we would.
Right.
So are you saying we'd still consider a
Why don't we still consider
regulatory
this-
scheme, but let the moratorium expire because our underlying zoning?
Because our zoning already has that, and then we can look into considering what Mr. Bonacci's saying, and then we can, clarify.
I'll wait for you.
That's just a thought, like why, we already want to change this anyways, we should look into that and make it one blanket statement to prevent stores from selling low-dose THC.
Primarily,
Just read it.
Primarily.
low dose.
Do not do it in an emergency and just read
Can I
it.
hear what Sam had to say?
Still expires.
It's just,
That's an argument.
he's just trying
Fires
to,
and we already have.
Yeah, but that's
because the moratorium
to get
expires.
into it, somebody.
But do we really need
I don't know
this,
what's
though?
available.
We already have it. It's not like someone coming
I would
in,
ask
open up
for
shop.
back.
We're still going to consider regulations.
What do you guys think? Should we?
Expired, that's fine.
You guys think we should just pass on this?
I would, to you, I think that it's two different issues to me.
And I would.
You would
I
send it?
would pass this, and you can always
Concerned about even.
change it
out that
when,
it's,
if you wanted to add that in the future.
Publicly.
And just also, I know how that we could change that to let the manufacturing go in. You do an option, you do a motion on 1 and 3, but I don't feel like doing, I mean, I don't see the
So
benefit.
you agree we should just pass on this tonight?
No, I was not going to do an amendment to change, but I'd still pass this tonight on the advice of my law director, in my opinion.
Okay, but we'll amend it to,
I wasn't going to amend it either, I was just
Oh,
going to
just-
let.
I will tell you that normally speaking, I think you asked this, I didn't answer because I was following up with the mayor on something related to that. But I think generally speaking, if you are considering regulations, whether or not we're going to package some other, or just explore other regulatory ideas, I think it is more customary that you would retain at least the moratorium on that piece. Because remember, one of the big things that I've talked about here, and I really do believe in, is the idea of clarity for our business and residences, so they just know the moratorium's still intact, council's studying the issue. That's a lot easier than, well, did they release the moratorium, and what does that mean now that planners are handling questions? You know, is it permitted here, is it not permitted here? You know, for us, we're very intimately familiar with the dual layers of regulation here, but I think it's maybe clearer, and maybe we have sometimes, you know, an incentive to just make it simpler for our users, our customer service, if you
all
will.
right, thank you, Mr. Zan. I think what we're going to do is, I think we'll read it as it is, we'll vote on it tonight as it is, and we can always amend it in a couple weeks,
For sure.
some of these other comments. We
Or
can always come
create
back
a
to it.
new
It'd be created
independent
new.
piece of legislation.
Right, either
I think
way,
it
but
should be
I-
a standing legislation.
And I don't think it's necessary, after thinking out it and reading it, I don't think it's necessary to take the manufacturing, cultivation, processing out of this, because as Rebecca said, she doesn't have anybody, it's 90 days. If you were going to do a manufacturing site, you talk to us about that first, we could fix that. So I just leave it alone the way
Yeah, that's a
that
good
the
point.
law director put it together.
That makes sense.
I agree.
Yeah.
So, are there any other comments on that? All right, perfect, thank you. That was brief. Ms. Collins, any audience participation?
We do. We have Dan Stoffer.
Yeah, right. We're going to have to rip through everything else.
Yeah, you will.
Hi, good evening.
I'm
My
Stoffer.
name's Dan Stoffer, 2091 Gary Drive, and I'm here to speak about the new zoning code, specifically about the garage setback requirement, where the garage has to be no less than 3 feet from the front of the house. I'd like to hand out just the section of the code, if you don't mind what I'm referring to. I can get in. Sure. So the first thing I want to say is I do appreciate everybody's effort in the new zoning code. You know, I know that there was a very long process that was done, and it ended up with a 281 or so page document that you know, I assume there's some things that everybody likes, and I assume there's some things that people won't appreciate. But there's this one issue here about the garage setback that I think is a little bit problematic. And the reason that I think that is that if you drive down the streets in Twinsburg, I would estimate that over 90% of the houses don't currently abide by this requirement. I know that my house doesn't, I know my father's house doesn't, I know my brother's house doesn't, and I don't think any of your houses do either. And the requirement is that your garage has to be 3 feet further back than the main face of your house. If that's the requirement, and you know, it's a long document, and I assume that the process that took place involved advisors, committees, commissions, consultants, and residents. And I noticed that on May 6th, that was not a provision in the draft of the code. But on May 25th, somehow that made it in there. And don't really know how. I did look on the city's website where you have all the correspondence. I didn't see any mention of that being a concern of anybody's. So, however, got there. The ordinance was approved by the city in July 11th, I think, to put it on the ballot, and the voters voted on it. So now it's part of our zoning code. I guess I have a problem with that because now my house is not compliant with the zoning code, and I think that's fine when you have things like, where the horse and buggy is no longer there and you need to add garage spaces. But I think something like this is just cosmetic in nature. And the reason that I'm here is because I also do home design for some builders. And I had a plan that we worked hard for 6 or 8 weeks to design a house that looks just like all the other houses in Twinsburg, and it was immediately rejected after a lot of work, which is fine. I can redesign the house. But I know that builder went through a lot of time and effort with me, and now he's going to be delayed while we do a different house design, which is fine. We haven't started building. But I think you're going to end up with other people in that same predicament.
Was a variance an option for you?
I asked if a variance was an option to the planning manager, I think it is, or the zoning manager, and it said no because it's a new code. So a variance might be an option. I would argue something like this is more, something you should do through architectural review or something like that. It shouldn't be part of your code, because I think you'll run into situations where you'll require people to get variances because the lot that they live on doesn't abide by that. There's a lot of reasons that I don't think it should be. I just wanted to make my feelings known. I'd like for you guys to do whatever you can do to try to get this resolved, because I think you're going to run into, if you just drive home tonight or in the morning, look around, and very few of the houses meet this requirement. And it doesn't seem like we should be passing rules to regulate something like that. We should, it's an aesthetic thing. I would argue that most of the houses you see with the garage forward of the house, a lot of times it's meant to be part of a porch. There's a lot of good reasons to do that. There's a few bad ones, and now we have something in the code about the few bad things that we're trying to control. So I would just say, as a designer, as a resident of Twinsburg, and I would just think that this is something that you guys might want to take up in a certain way to try to resolve or eliminate or have a workaround for. Just my thoughts.
I think that's the plan.
Okay. So you know where I stand on it, and if you want me to be involved, I'd be happy to.
Is the planning commission already looking at this?
I believe they are.
Okay.
Okay.
But I appreciate anything you can do to get this resolved. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Stoffer.
Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate
Good
you.
night, Dan.
That's all we have this evening.
Okay, thank you. Pending legislation, ordinance 01 through 04. These are ordinances for the notice of intent to establish a TIF district for certain parcels of real property pursuant to the Ohio Revised Code. This includes setting up individual funds for the deposit of service payments and specifying the purpose for which said payments may be expended. Districts planned include the construction of Anderson Materials, Old Mill Storage, Extra Lease, and Let's Get Storage. These will all be on their third and final reading tonight. Are there any questions? Ordinance 05-2025. This is for a new topic agreement for Formtech Inc., who will be relocating their headquarters from Warrensville Heights to Dutton Drive. They will have 91 full-time employees by December 31st, 2028, with an estimated payroll of $5.12 million by this date. The city will provide a grant equivalent to 25% of income tax collected for a total of 5 years. This will be on its third and final reading. Are there any concerns or thoughts? Ordinance 18-2025. This ordinance is to award the 2025 road program bid to Perrin Asphalt. The total amount, including the alternates, is $1.95 million. The three-reading rule is being asked to be suspended with an emergency clause to enter the contracts and review drawings and materials before the start of construction. Any comments or concerns for this? Resolution 19, 2025. This resolution authorizes internet auctions for 2025. Per Ohio Revised Code 721.15, the City Council is able to adopt a resolution to authorize online auctions for personal property owned by the city. If adopted, this resolution would allow the city to continue with online auctions for 2025 using GovDeals or a similar online auction site. This is an annual piece of legislation that is required to sell items online. The 3 reading rules being asked to be suspended with an emergency clause to continue with the process that has been established. Are there any concerns or thoughts, comments for Resolution 19? Ordinance 20, 2025. This ordinance is to extend the moratorium for recreational marijuana for 3 months. The 3 reading rules being asked to be suspended with an emergency clause to extend the moratorium before the current one expires, which will allow additional time to create the needed business regulations. I think we've talked about that more than enough. Anyone else? Ordinance 21, 2025. This ordinance is to purchase a new microwave link for use by our dispatch center. This will be through state bid in the amount not to exceed $113,725.95. The 3 reading rule is being asked to be suspended with an emergency clause to enter the agreement as soon as possible and get the new units installed as soon as possible to prevent network disruptions. Are there any concerns?
Excuse me, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. Vazana.
But not tonight. On 21, we are not asking that you suspend, we're asking that you not take any action tonight. Don't read it, just skip over it. There's a little bit of background here. When the contract was initially submitted for legislation to be presented to the council, NASPO, which you'll see on there, was identified as the cooperative purchasing entity that we were going to buy that through. Over the last, it's probably only a couple of days, maybe 4 or 5 days, the entity, the vendor who we were going to buy that through was actually awarded the state of Ohio schedule on that. So we're in the process of getting the state of Ohio pricing for that, not the NASPO pricing, and we're going to update that because it's going to be a little bit more of an efficient way to directly buy it through, I think it's B&C, who we've worked with in the past. So skip over that tonight. We're going to be introducing an amended version of that, or frankly, a new piece of legislation, not an amended version, that will authorize a contract with B&C pursuant to the Ohio purchasing schedules, as opposed to having to do the two-step of authorizing this city to participate in NASPO, which is a national cooperative purchasing entity. We're going to go with one of the entities that you have previously authorized the city administration to use, which would be the Ohio schedules. So, yeah, I believe B&C actually won the state scheduled in February, so just a couple days ago. For the same items, so the same stuff, but we're going to buy it through the state of Ohio schedule.
All right, perfect.
So just skip over that, no action necessary. Thank you, and sorry for the detour at the end.
You are so okay. All right. Are there any other comments, questions, concerns from anyone on council before we adjourn the meeting? No? Anyone? Mayor, law director, anyone? Anything to bring up? All right, so it is now 7:28, and we will adjourn the caucus meeting.